more solidarity, is led by the interests and needs of the emerging mass class, not by yesterday's. That's the first thing if you look back at transformations. The second principle is that every new forward march towards more emancipation, solidarity, and equality involves new forms of collective action. Not the old forms, new forms. And the third principle is that every new forward march involves three overlapping struggles. The first struggle is a struggle for recognition, a struggle to define yourself in class terms and give yourself subjectivity, a moving away from a point in which you look in the mirror in the morning or in a public toilet, because you probably haven't got a mirror wherever you're staying. Instead of seeing a failure, a miserable person who's a failure, you can look in the mirror and you say, hey, I'm part of a group. I shouldn't feel sorry for myself. I'm part of millions. There are lots like me. It's the result of structures. It's the result of processes. It's the result of what they want. Now, however you come to that feeling, you are strengthening your sense of agency and strengthening your identity. I'll give one story, if I may. I was addressing an Occupy movement in this country, a big one, the end of 2011, talking about the Precariat. And it was outside, big circle, plastic chairs, people sitting on boxes, bonfire off on the right. Halfway through my talk, a man, open shirt, big beer belly, came through this plastic chair over his shoulder, strode towards me. I thought, what have I said? What have I said? Have I said something wrong to offend him? Came to the middle of the circle, plonked his chair down, crossed his arms like this, walked around very theatrically, and sat down, looking at me. I thought, well, okay, I better just continue, as if this is quite normal. Went on for another 5 minutes, and he suddenly stood up, equally theatrically looked around, showed his bare belly, and suddenly said, "It's me he's talking about," and sat down. Now, I didn't tell that story in Sweden when it happened again. Another man stood up at the end of a talk and said he hated my speech. I thought, oh dear, I hadn't connected. Yeah, I hated your speech. I know, sorry about that. He said, it's all about me. Now, this sense in which people are coming to recognize themselves is essential first step. Because one of the challenges of the Precariat as of today is that the Precariat is potentially a transformative class, if there are any Marxists here. A transformative class is one that wants to become sufficiently strong to be able to abolish the conditions that define it, and therefore abolish itself. You can't say that about any other class grouping in society. That makes it radical. Now, the second struggle is a struggle for representation. That's not really begun yet. The struggle to make sure that the voice of the Precariat is in every agency of the state, in all our social agencies, in our unions, in our various forms of institution, in our universities. That's a good start. The third struggle, which is really what defines the Charter, is a struggle for redistribution. But a redistribution of what? It's not as going to be a struggle like the old socialist struggle of 100 years ago for the means of production. If you start talking like that, you're going to lose 90% of the Precariat. It's going to be a struggle for the redistribution of the crucial assets that define a good life for a Precariat person in the 21st century. Where do you start? There are 6 key assets if you're in the precariat. The first is a struggle for the redistribution of security itself. If you're in the precariat, you have 0 security. If you're up in the salariat or in the elite or wherever, you have plenty of it. The distribution of security is far more unequal than the distribution of income in our society. The second is time, quality time. Again, the distribution is far more unequal than the distribution of income. If you're in the precariat, a woman with a small child, or constantly being told you've got to retrain and do this and be a standby, you've got no control of your time at all. 0. Up here you can buy expertise, you can leisurely go between whatever you do and call it work or labor, and come home and say you've been working all day when really you've been drinking with colleagues. That sort of thing is fundamental. We need a politics of time. The third is quality space. Again, what we've seen with the privatization and commercialization of the commons, the shrinking of the social commons, the shrinking of the geographical commons, is a global thing. Getty Park, the Istanbul riots, whatever you want to call them, was a classic demonstration of the need of the precariat for the commons. If you're up in the salariat, you don't need public toilets, you don't need free museums, you don't need libraries that are being closed and commercialized. But if you're in the precariat, you need all of those things. You need that part to give your life a meaning and a dignity. The next asset, which is becoming far more unequally distributed than we care to admit, is education. Because the commodification of education has gone with the fact that if you're up in the salariat or you're a child of somebody in the salariat or the elite and so on, you can still go to Boston, places like that, or my old alma mater, Cambridge, and you'll get a liberating education, teaching you your history, your culture, your ethics, your philosophy. But if you're down in the precariat, you're getting subject increasingly to a commodified form of modular training with the removal of all of those things because they're not worth it. That commodification, which I document and I talk about, is something that is really a form of inequality that is underappreciated. The next key asset is financial knowledge. If you have access to financial knowledge or people who can give you advice, you can make far more money and not lose money. Whereas if you're in the precariat, you can't understand those bloody forms. You have to spend so much time that you haven't got. You make mistakes, you worry about mistakes, you delay, you don't do it, you don't fill in these assessment forms. You pay a price. That is also part of the inequality. And finally, capital itself. Now, my charter, to get to the final bit, I apologize if I've taken too much of your time, but the drinks are still there. The charter that I've drawn up has 29 articles, which is very parsimonious by comparison with the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta, although it was only on one page, and mine is, I don't know how many pages it is, but much more, the Magna Carta was one very big page, and it had 63 articles. But the good thing is that you don't need some of the articles, such as Article 50 of the Magna Carta, because Article 50 of the Magna Carta ruled out as unsuitable for holding any public office a number of key people, including a certain Mark Phillip, better known to most of you in this room as the Sheriff of Nottingham. We fortunately don't need an equivalent of that today, although if anyone is interested, I've just written a satirical piece about the parallels, historical parallels between the events that led up to the Magna Carta and where we are today. Now, the 29 articles are an attempt to bring together a prognosis based on the analysis I've been giving tonight. I won't go through those 29, you'll be very pleased to know. Part of it is about a need to strengthen the rights of work, starting with the most fundamental of all, which was need to reconceptualize what it is we mean by work and overhaul our labor statistics. They go through the need to respond to the ridiculous recruitment practices that are growing up and to shift the costs of those recruitment practices onto firms away from the precariat, through regulating the new forms of labor that are taking place, that many of which have not been incorporated into our labor analysis, including crowd labor. Crowd labor may become the biggest single form of labor transaction within the next decade, and yet our textbooks have not addressed crowd labor at all. Online Dutch auctioning of tasks globally. Millions are already involved, and major corporations that are not yet household names are making billions of dollars from crowd labor. We need to regulate it and respond to it. Going through next to a set of articles about the need to revive associational freedom, Republican freedom, not just libertarian freedom. Going back to Hannah Arendt and back to Aristotle, who said we can only realize our freedom through collective action. And taking that through into what institutions are needed. So there are a set of articles on that. Then there are 5 articles about saying how we must overcome class-based migration policy. We have a most disgusting class-based migration policy today. If you're a crook and an oligarch, and anybody who wants to go through to become a citizen in any country, you get the red carpet treatment, you get subsidies, you get yes sir, no sir. The further you go into the precariat, the greater the costs and the barriers and the demonization. The next set of things deal with strategies to decommodify education and how to rescue the commons and revive the commons. But the last 2 that I want to mention is the need to respond to the breakdown of the income distribution system with 2 policies. The first policy is that we must move towards, note what I say, move towards having universal basic income as a right of every person living in your country or my country. Every man, every woman, every child. As a right. Not as an entitlement for doing labor or an entitlement because you're poor and you're a deserving poor, but as a right. Now, there are various objections that have been made to basic income over the years about its affordability, about whether it will reduce labor supply, whether it will induce wasteful spending, whether it will be inflationary. And I deal with all those questions not only in these books, but in our organization that was mentioned. Anybody can join it. It's called Bien, and we've got thousands of great people who've joined. But a basic income would have some wonderful positive properties. It's affordable. And one of the properties is that it would give people basic security and a greater sense of being in control of their time. A greater ability in extremists to say no. Very important. The ability to say no. We did a pilot in Namibia, and it was a very telling moment when I was in the villages and I was talking to a group of young women, and I said, how is the basic income? How are you? How is it useful or not? And they said the best thing, and they all started giggling. The best thing is when the men come down from the agricultural estates at the end of the month, Now we can say no. That ability to be able to refuse degradation is an important justification. Most importantly, though, is the ethical basis that goes back to Thomas Paine, one of my intellectual heroes, and should be the intellectual hero of every American. And basically, Thomas Paine recognized that your income, my income, our wealth, is far more due to the efforts of our ancestors than anything you or I do. But we don't know whose ancestors is responsible for your income, my income. So in a sense, a basic income would be like a social dividend paid out of the wealth created by our ancestors. That powerful ethical justification to me is important. But there are also instrumental reasons for supporting a basic income. And in the pilots that Ellen mentioned that we've just done in India, and if anyone's interested, got a copy of the book that we've just produced this month, we carried out an experiment where thousands of people, men, women, and children, each individually with the money for the children paid to the mother, and we gave completely unconditional the money, very modest amount, every month for 18 months. And we evaluated through a randomized controlled trial and other methodologies the impact. And if you go to those villages today, you will do what I do. Get emotional. Because it's transformed those communities. It's transformed the lives of those people. And most fundamentally, it's been emancipatory. They feel they have a greater sense of control over their lives. It comes through the stories, it comes through the data. And in the process, they have managed to do what most of us would do. Contrary to what all the skeptics, which included Sonia Gandhi when she first discussed it with us, contrary to what they say that they will lead people to be lazy. No. People work more, not less. And when they work, they're more productive, not less. And when they work, they're more cooperative with others, not less. Wouldn't that be the same with most of us here? That's what happens. People actually want to improve their lives. And we've shown in this experiment, and now it's being discussed in all the Indian national newspapers and TV and so on, so we're still hoping that something will take place. But a basic income is something that we should be moving towards for all our societies, because that is the only feasible way of providing income security for people in the precariat. And the final bit is that we must move towards the creation of democratically controlled sovereign wealth funds, capital funds. You in this country have a wonderful model that's been working since a stray Republican governor in a moment of, I don't know what it was, but he was quite a nice, quirky man. I met him. He introduced in 1976 in Alaska the Alaska Permanent Fund. It's a capital fund which every year gives out a dividend at the end. So every person in Alaska receives it. When they began that fund, Alaska had the highest poverty rate in the United States and the highest inequality in the United States. Guess what it has today? The lowest poverty rate and the lowest Gini coefficient of income inequality. We can have national sovereign wealth funds which don't just take the proceeds of oil, but high-tech, rent-seeking corporations. And we have to move to an agenda that involves capital redistribution through such mechanisms. I've talked too long, I'm sure you agree, but I'm looking forward to a glass of wine in a couple of minutes. But I want to end by saying that out there in the Precariat, there's a fantastic energy, a fantastic feeling. They've moved through the primitive rebel phase of 2011 and Occupy and Indignados and so on, to a point of re-engagement and forming ideas of the future. It's coming messily, but that energy is wonderfully invoked in something that I quote twice in the book, once at the beginning and once at the end. A wonderful piece of graffiti on a wall in Madrid. A piece of graffiti just said, the worst thing would be to return to the old normal. Reflect on it and you'll find it's quite a subversive statement. Thank you very much for listening. If you like.
Would you want to take some questions? So before we break up, that's our Plenary tradition. Introduce yourself.
Contemporary University of Norwegian. Two interrelated questions. First, how did we get to this point? Number one, I don't think that was articulated. Number two, your solutions. Nobody in this room would disagree with them.
Who would be the first?
That they are all to be undertaken into the context of the current state and its apparatus. There's where you might have a disagreement amongst us. Me. And you know what I'm talking about.
No, of course. I think I'm not going to answer the first part, but it is answered at length in the books. How do we get here? I'm not doing it for that reason. I'm just saying that it's actually I would have to give a long answer. But I think many of the things can be encapsulated in one single sentence. That about 1980, fear changed sides. That is very clear. And one of the wonderful things, I've used this term often in my work, and one of the wonderful things when I was in Spain, that the most popular song at the moment, pop song, which has almost become the song of Podemos, is precisely that theme. Fear will change sides. And that I think is happening at the moment. You saw that at Davos last year, when the big subject of all those corporate titans was worrying about growing inequality and the threat to their model. Now, in the last chapter of the Charter, I address your latter question, okay? I think the neoliberal state has certain fundamental internal weaknesses where we can actually make a lot of progress in challenging the very legitimacy, the lies that underpin it, okay? And one of the biggest things, which I put in the center of the Charter, and I didn't mention, but for me is I'm passionately worried about, is the complete travesty of due process. The ability of them to be prattling on about freedom when they're not allowing people in the Precariat any semblance of due process. When they take away benefits, do you think that people are charged with something, found guilty through a proper procedure, through proper peer group review? When you think of it, 95% of people who are found guilty in this country now go through a process of plea bargaining and accept some sentence because they can't either afford or risk minimum sentencing and so on. It's happening everywhere, this removal of due process. It's a fundamental weakness of the neoliberal state because it goes against their ideology. We're not surprised by it. But I think actually there are a lot of things that are in the Charter that allow for the possibility of cross-class alliances on those particular policies. And due process is certainly one of them. Proficient.
Their lifestyle look like, and then I think Salarian, and then Salarian, and then on the other end, are we talking, what is the lifestyle of somebody that is on the verge of the next class down?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lovely question. I think if you were to meet, I immediately have pictured in my mind 3 women that I've got to know as a result of contacting me because they're in the Precariat. At one end you have highly educated person, may have a PhD, hasn't been able to get into the lower rungs of the profession, having to take a lower level job for money, and then falls into a particular type of precarity trap. Precarity trap which arises, and there are data to show this is a reality, that the very fact that you've taken a lower level job raises the barrier to you getting a professional job. I give in the book some examples from the United States and elsewhere of precisely that phenomenon, and a lot of people, that is the case. Another type of experience is someone will take a permanent, a regular job well below their qualifications, hoping that they'll be able to gravitate upwards. That in itself will block them getting up. It's bizarre, but that's happening, and I document it. So those people are aspiring to be proficients. Many of them don't want long-term employment, the type of jobs that are long-term don't attract them, but they can't get out of their debt trap, their precarity trap, and it drives them down. And within a few years, they suddenly find they don't have the skills that they thought they had. And that makes people very angry. The other type of experience that you're talking about is far more common. This is a case with someone that comes out of school or whatever. Their parents run out of savings. They have to rent an accommodation somewhere, one-room place. They lose a low wage job. Their debts mount. They're waiting for benefits. They lose their apartment. They go and stay on someone's sofa. They run out of patience. They drift into some drug taking or to some petty crime and drift into the streets. And they're out in the lumpen precariat. Now, I don't think any of us in this room would know too many of those, but I bet we know some. So you've got a spectrum of people going through different channels of experience, but all in a situation of precariousness, at some stage or other becoming a supplicant, which is so degrading that it actually will diminish their humanity and diminish their capacity to get out. And that, I think, is where so many people are with social illnesses and homelessness, that's the sort of society that we are creating. The talk I gave in Cornell, I dedicated my talk to 90-year-old Arnold Abbott, who should become a national hero. Arnold Abbott was charged with the heinous crime in Fort Lauderdale of only attempting to feed the homeless. And he was threatened with 60 days imprisonment and a fine of $500. I thought, what sort of society, when 32 of your cities makes it a crime to feed the homeless? It's happening in other countries too, so don't think I'm being anti-American or anything like that. It's happening, it's because of this utilitarian politics that we've got, that we look after the happiness of the majority and never mind the minorities. And I lambast that in the new book. So I think your question is very good. The spectrum is very wide, but you get the point.
No affiliation other than that I'm a remaining member of the Precariat. Just a quick question, two questions really. Would you agree that there is a rising number of the Precariat in academia? And if you do agree, which I kind of thought you would, what are tenured academics doing in support of those that are part of the Precariat within academia?
Very good question. I think actually it's rather sobering and extremely sad that the divisions within academic communities have become incredible, with incredible hypocrisy by those in the Precariat and the elite. The same class structures that we're getting more generally are reproduced in academia. You have an elite that are subject to footballer-type transfer fees, between universities, and you have a Precariat. And the trouble with the Precariat is they actually know their material interests benefit from having a Precariat down below. Because instead of a system of mobility inside where your differentials were quite small, now the differentials have grown because of all administrative winner-takes-all type tendencies, and the growing Precariat of adjuncts and sessionals and auxiliaries who are revoltingly exploited, and they don't know what they're teaching until this morning or whatever, This situation has become completely degrading, and huge divisions inside academia. Now, I had a big argument with Eric Wright recently. I gave a keynote at the Global Sociological Association in Yokohama, and he had a big argument with me. He said, look, there's only one united working class. And I said, well, just look in the academia. You haven't got a unity there. Because he was saying academics, he was just focusing on academics. And I think it's unrealistic to say there's a sense of unity. There's a Precariat and the Precariat. They may say the right things in the right moments, but they're not doing much about it.
My name is Ohara from University of Nagasaki. I'm interested regarding question about that sovereign wealth fund. You mentioned the last portion, so that particularly you example the ASSA permanent fund. Can you explain further the role of the sovereign wealth fund, or because this one another good example.
I think that this, I'm just looking for, I was going to give a quotation, but I can't find it offhand. I think sovereign wealth funds, we now have a situation where something like 65 countries have established sovereign wealth funds. Most of those countries, the sovereign wealth funds are a way of extracting rent and giving it to the plutocracy and the elite. But several of these wealth funds have actually become important redistributive mechanisms. Besides the Alaska Permanent Fund, I think the one that's worked best so far is the Norwegian pension fund, from petrol. It's originally called petrol, it's now became the Norwegian pension fund. It's a capital fund which has accumulated a vast amount of income from North Sea oil by the same sort of mechanisms as in Alaska. And in effect, it's meant that every Norwegian citizen today is a millionaire because it is able to give dividends out and afford to support social policies and so on. I'm proposing that there should be a fracking fund, but I may be using a word that we could think of a better use in case it gets misinterpreted, because all the proceeds of natural resources should be subject to a tax that pays a dividend to all of us. And the same one could say the same for any rent acquiring patent system. Most of the corporations that make their vast billions are doing so with patents that have been the result of publicly funded research. And it is a ridiculous system to say that this is an encouragement for private risk-taking and blah, blah, blah. It's a lie. It's a lie. And therefore, I think the ethical justification for saying that part of the proceeds should be going either in equities or in other forms into building up a capital fund. And the capital fund would be charged with terms of reference that would require it to invest and have enough money to gradually build up the capacity, as with Alaska and Norway, so that everybody would have a basic income. It's possible, it's feasible, and I think we're going to see that mechanism develop quite strongly in the next few years. I think one would be fully entitled to be pessimistic. As you were speaking, the famous aphorism of Gramsci came to mind. But I think there is a reason for optimism, which is precisely that we have the lessons of history, the 1930s and 1940s. This growth of the ugly far right is a very scary phenomenon, is a very powerful phenomenon. One should not underestimate it at all. When I first was writing about the likelihood of it growing back in 2009, a lot of people said, no, that's not, no. But it's been growing and growing and growing, right? I think we can only counter it by having what I call in the book a politics of paradise. Unless we have a strategy that's an alternative, how can we expect enough people to re-engage politically? Because one of the phenomena over the last 7 years has been precisely the political disengagement of many people in the Precariat. But one of the things I always say is that we can't take that reaction, because if you do, you basically surrender to the panopticon state and all the Benthamite things that I talked about, the politics of inferno. I think what's happened, and is happening as we're here, is this phase of recognition is transforming many people into feeling that they are part of a class for itself, going from a class in the making to a class for itself. You could say I'm being utopian, idealistic, or whatever, and maybe, but I think that there is this energizing. I was in Japan recently, and I was very encouraged by the fritas and the movements that are beginning to take place there, in Korea, in Italy, in Greece, in Spain and Sweden. There's a lot of energy which is beginning to re-engage. And I think that is a reason for hope. And I think it's important for teachers and all of us to be standing up and participating. That's why I've been, I'm extraordinarily privileged to be able to be involved in basic income experiments, because this is a humbling experience, but only if we actually become involved will there be a hope. And I think it's attendant on all of us to re-engage and not be cynical. I'm not saying you are, if you're in the AFL, then I understand. But I think, for example, unions have to reinvent themselves. They really have to reinvent themselves. And that's the subject I address in the book. But the atmosphere is changing. There's a lot more energy out there.